Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Sally Davies, editor at Eon Magazine, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the Brocher Meetup on whether or not disaster response can be neutral. We are going to spend a little over an hour together today. I'm just going to say a few words to frame the discussion. The panelists will then introduce themselves and give some short presentations, and then we're going to open things up for discussion. So, as is always the case, questions from attendees are very welcome. Please do feel free to use the Q&A to pose them. I apologise in advance if we don't get to your question. We get to as many as we possibly can, but invariably we leave some people hanging. So, to the discussion today. For much of the past century, the humanitarian response to disaster has organised itself around principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, largely inherited from the Red Cross movement. These principles have served as a kind of passport, allowing aid convoys to cross conflict lines and doctors and nurses to treat combatants from any side. However, arguably this passport has come at a price. To be neutral is also to be strategically silent, choosing not to call out the political conditions and human decisions about whose life is expendable and which arguably create disasters in the first place. Crucially, neutrality also asks that the people working on the ground affect an impartiality that their own histories and conscience may not truly grant them. So perhaps the question on the table today is not really whether neutrality is good or bad. It is whether neutrality is even possible. And if it isn't, what we ought to do with the institutions and protocols built on its promise. Is there space for neutrality that doesn't dismiss it as either a comforting illusion nor elevate it as a sacred and untouchable professional value? What would a more honest reckoning with the politics of disaster really look like? So today's three panelists come at this question from three different scales: the institutions of disaster response, the structural conditions that turn hazards into disasters, and the personal histories that responders themselves carry into the work. So with that, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. I'm just going to take you in the order that you appear on my screen. Keith, would you like to begin?
Thank you so much, Sally, for having me. So I'm Kees Boersma. I'm at the Free University in Amsterdam at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, where I'm a professor on crisis, governance, and societal resilience for about 20 years, studying responses to crisis from an academic point of view, yet as much as I can in collaboration with practitioners, professionals, and grassroots organizations responding to disaster situations. Not necessarily always in the hot phase, let's say, of a disaster, but also prior to a disaster that may happen in a disaster-prone area, or in the aftermath of a disaster situation. So what I use is, as much as I can, participatory approaches, meaning trying to be engaged with those who are affected by the disaster. And the reason why I do that is can be part of the discussion that we have during the webinar.
Thank you so much, Keith. And I think we're going to return to you for a brief presentation before we begin the discussion. Ilan, I'll hand over to you now.
Hello, I'm Ilan Kelman. I'm at University College London, and I'm in two departments there, the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction and the Institute for Global Health, the mandate being to connect disasters and health. I also have a position at the Arctic University of Norway above the Arctic Circle in Tromsø, Norway. In connecting disasters and health, we find a baseline being prevention is better than cure. Also, prevention is cheaper than cure, and that's what gives a lot of weight these days in terms of money rather than lives. The challenge is how to achieve that, how to move away from the expectation that response brings attention, resources, and interest to ensure that adequate, equivalent attention, interest, and resources goes to stopping the need for response in the first place. That is a clear stance. Am I being neutral? Is there neutrality in trying to save lives rather than pick up the pieces afterwards? These are some of the fundamental questions. I do deal with them in my research somewhat philosophically and conceptually, always trying to apply them in practice and operationally, sort of operational ethics. A key component is disaster diplomacy. How and why dealing with disasters before, during, and after may influence political decisions, or generally may not necessarily influence political decisions. Are disasters neutral? Are any of the words that we use, preparedness, prevention, planning, response, emergency management, recovery, rehabilitation, are the words themselves, the concepts, the actions, are those neutral? I'm certain most of the audience would tend to answer, no, there is no neutrality in any of them, which then goes back to that question of today's seminar and what you mentioned, Sally, well, is anything really neutral? And in disaster diplomacy, we find that at baseline, and this should not come as a surprise, everything is political. Everything is about the interests of the individual, the institution, the organization, which is sometimes government or maybe others. There is really no neutrality. But yet, many of the organizations, we mentioned Red Cross, Red Crescent, Red Crystal, and others, of course, state and try to apply, try to operationalize neutrality, impartiality, independence. How do we solve this? Is it even a contradiction? Do we want to even try and solve any contradiction? Well, I think these are the questions that we're going to address. And for people to stay in touch after this seminar, to give me your ideas and your thoughts, I've put my contact details in the chat. I look forward to exchanging and learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilan, for that comprehensive introduction. Emily, I'll pass over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Ragas, and I'm at the University of Amsterdam. I am a PhD student there, only for a small time longer, because I've just submitted my PhD, which is always exciting. But I also am a postdoctoral researcher at the Amsterdam Institute of Global Health and Development. And I am a little bit more unusual because although I studied disasters, I actually came to academia quite late, and I started off with a whole career that was really operational. So I worked as an emergency nurse for 15 years, and during that time, I was a helicopter trauma retrieval nurse, and I did some large-scale aeromedical retrievals, including one time in Vanuatu. And it was the first time that I was really exposed to this idea of crisis and disaster and mass casualty event, because it was a large bus crash that required a lot of aeromedical retrieval assets to move patients back to Australia. And what that experience did was it really opened me up to thinking about disasters, thinking about disaster response teams and really what they actually are, but also how neutral that they can be. And in that scenario, I was taking patients that were Australian back to Australia, giving them access to healthcare, but leaving people who then didn't have access to the same level of healthcare. And it opened up a lot of moral questions for me as a responder. Then fast forward a few years, and I was working for the International Committee of the Red Cross. And at the time, it was at the very early days of the war in Ukraine. And I was working as part of a team that was trying to set up a pre-hospital healthcare and ambulance service in the area. And once again, we were confronted with this idea about neutrality. We'd come from countries that were very pro-Ukraine, and that there was a lot of flags going around, and people were talking about their ideas about this war. And then we were face to face with Russian soldiers. And it gave me a really interesting idea about how my own political beliefs and ideas can then be brought into conversation with the work that I'm doing. My PhD now looks at a disaster that happened, a major flood in Durban, South Africa, where almost 600 people died. And I look at it from two perspectives. So I look at those who were really badly impacted by the flood, the ones who were from vulnerable situations where their homes had been washed away, they didn't have access to resources, and they mainly lived informally. And then at the same time, I looked at the helicopter responders, so the urban search and rescue teams, the military, the canine dogs and their handlers. And I looked at how these two different groups spoke about the floods, spoke about repair, and what repair really means in a world that's constantly breaking. So how can we understand recovery or healing in a place where you're constantly having a chronicity of crisis, which we saw within this flood and the history that has happened in Durban. So I will leave it there, and perhaps there'll be some more questions. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic scene setter for all of us. I just wanted to hand it back to Kees briefly. Kees, did you want to say any further remarks? I'm just conscious you introduce yourself and your affiliations, but did you want to take this opportunity to say anything further about your research, or would you prefer us to just dive straight into the discussion?
Yes, just zooming out to my own position and background, having a background in what we call science and technology studies, I'm used to reflect on how we produce knowledge, also in academia, and doing disaster research is in a way also producing knowledge about the disasters, about the things that Ilan and Emily were talking about, the boundaries of the disaster, who is defining the disaster, who owns the disaster in a way, is calling something a disaster and political act in the first place and all that. Next to that, about the ownership of potential solutions. We have a recent debate on issues of localization in reflection on us responders, but also academics literally flying in to a disaster zone and then coming with solutions with our research questions and then addressing the people that are affected by the disasters as subjects of research, so to say. The potential answer to that in my own research is to adopt what I call the participatory approach or even participatory action approach. Meaning that you are trying to become an engaged scholar, working together with people that are affected by the disaster, living in the local community, for example, that is affected by the disaster. This in itself is not a neutral act, because again, zooming into that question is, who then will address what kind of questions are relevant? If you are coming with certain solutions to, for example, disaster risk reduction, whose voices are being recognized as relevant. So a theoretical concept that I use is epistemic justice, for example. So to the answer, can that ever be neutral? The answer is no. But then the question is should that hold us from doing research and even action research? The answer is also no. But then it comes to the question, if you then are being engaged with participatory research, can that be open enough to really let all the voices being heard that are relevant, including those who are the most vulnerable? And then I'm running into a paradox that can also be part of the discussion, is that in disaster research, but disaster response in particular, you are trying to reach out for those who are the most vulnerable. But those who are the most vulnerable in disaster situations are never being heard. So and that is, some dilemma that you are run into.
Thank you, Kees. It's also very interesting, isn't it, to think of this parallelism between the scholarly ethics of neutrality and sort of detached study, and then the parallels with that and the operational ethics of neutrality in disaster response. And are these perfect mirrors of one another in terms of the challenges they throw up, or are there resonances or disconnects? So we can certainly get into that. Well, look, thank you all very much for that very rich introduction. I wanted to start with a somewhat basic question, although I suspect the answers to this will not be basic, which is, I wondered if together as a panel, you could take us back to the rise of neutrality as a historical construct. Where did it come from? How did it come about as a structuring idea in disaster response? And what was the historical context of the time that facilitated that adoption?
I mean, for me, there's a lot of stories and potentially even myths behind that. A lot of people will go back to the events which led to the founding of the Red Cross and then the Red Crescent and Red Crystal. In 1859, there was the Battle of Solferino, and from that came meetings and conventions with the idea that any wounded combatant deserved medical treatment equivalently on the battlefield to heal them. That is a baseline of what we think about as being neutral or non-aligned. Some places use those words as synonyms, others will actually differentiate them. When it comes down to the long-term history, did it really begin there? What are the meanings? How has language changed? I actually don't know. I think this is research to be done, a book to be written, particularly from the operational perspective. Because back in the Battle of Solferino, and the people who were advocating for the treatment and working on the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and then Red Crystal were not speaking English. What are the different connotations? The idea must have come from somewhere. How far back does it go and in what languages? And even if we take it as a European construct from the 19th century, well, come on, I mean, modern humanity is about 14,000 years of history. There must be other concepts of this and other ways of applying it in traditional indigenous vernacular cultures around the world through the millennia. So to me, we have these ideas of where it came from and the foundations. I think there's a lot more to be understood.
Yeah, I really agree with that. Particularly for me, whenever I think about neutrality, I think about that story of the doctors coming together and being annoyed by what was the neutral stance of the Red Cross and then breaking away and becoming what we now know as MSF. And for me, that story is really interesting because I used to work for the Red Cross. And culturally, as you were saying, Ilan, there are so many differences to what these ideas are and how we attach ourselves to them. And I found as an Australian, I think I had a very different perception to Europeans, but because I look European, I was always sort of lumped into that idea. And neutrality to me has a different meaning if I'm a nurse sitting in a war zone than it does if I'm a diplomat sitting in an office in Geneva. And I think that we do need to reconsider these and think through them and think, particularly in a time that we are now where we're getting constantly impacted by these disasters that are ultimately making these disaster response teams less sustainable. How do we think through neutrality within that perspective? Because we need to remember that there are actually people behind these machines that are going in to save people.
Thank you, Emily. Kees, did you have any remarks in response to that question, or should we move on?
Really on similar lines. So I'm not claim to be an expert on the history of humanitarian actions and all that, but also listening to the arguments, to things about the very instruments that are in place, both let's say the bureaucracies, but also the solutions translated into technologies, for example. So the bureaucracies themselves quite often being framed in terms of good governance. And then good governance being accountability, transparency, legitimacy. The questions that then emerge are, okay, who is accountable according to what? And according to whose rules and regulations, legitimacy, who has the legitimacy to act in a certain environment, and then transparency. So these are by far not neutral and yet quite often imposed to local communities in disaster context, versus an alternative approach can be thinking about reciprocity, for example, trust building, mutual ways of responsibility, right? So as an answer to that non-neutrality, that's one. So the institutional environment, and the other, the very instruments that are being used and put in place. Just to give a brief example is, nowadays, early warning systems are getting a lot of attention in disaster risk reduction, quite often based on AI solutions, where there are built-in biases in the very technology that are the foundations of the early warning systems, and not recognizes that there are biases in, for example, who is more vulnerable than another person in a disaster context. Not recognizing those biases definitely is. It's not just not being neutral, but it is inherently political.
It's very interesting too. I was struck by your reference, Ilan, to this notion of myth making, sort of irrespective of the actual documented empirical history of how the notion of neutrality came to be. There's certainly a lot of storytelling that happens at institutional levels about it. And then that actually brings me to your work, Emily, because you've written a lot about sort of the storytelling that happens at the individual level. And I was even struck in hearing your trajectory into this field about those moments from your experience as a first responder and nurse, where it felt like in those moments where you were evacuating Australians from Vanuatu and leaving others to suffer, that the notion of neutrality came under pressure for you in some way. Ilan, I understand you've sort of written elsewhere about how neutrality might be impossible, but it's kind of useful fiction. For you, Emily, I'm sensing that was neutrality useful to you in that context, or was that a moment where you felt a necessity for it to be transformed or changed or overthrown?
Yeah, I think for me, it can be very constrained, like it can be a constraint. And I think I might tell a story from my field work in relation to this, because I worked with a pilot who was quite political, and he was having a lot of trouble with one of the government that he was working with, the stance that they had politically. And he was saying that he was a helicopter pilot, and he was saying, the pilots of yesteryear were not political, but we're informed, and we're now going into places where I know that we're on the wrong side of history. And I thought that was really interesting, because it was this idea, particularly that disaster responders, and I know I'm putting myself into this category, where people assume that we're not political, and they assume that we haven't really thought through the political nuances of that, and we're really just there for the emergency and for the drama of the situation. And I think this is in part why I ended up leaving humanitarian aid. Was I did struggle with that level of neutrality, because it just seemed incredibly unfair that we weren't able to be political in this situation, to try and be like activists. And I know in saying that in itself is a difficult and complicated issue, because at what point then are you welcome into certain countries if you have an obvious political stance? But I do think that this is a conversation that needs to be had, because so many of the humanitarian agencies that we know, they're based on these hierarchical systems that are based on the Henry Dunant times of military humanitarianism. But now I think that we have changed and we've altered, and we need to look at, are these frameworks still sustainable in the places that humanitarian agencies are continuing to go into?
So, Emily, if I can press you on that, it sounds like you're very much in the camp of kind of, we need a wholesale reconfiguration of the structuring principles of these humanitarian organizations, and a kind of honesty about the embeddedness and necessary political entanglement of actors. Is that kind of how you would describe your position?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure now on different humanitarian agencies to be more active and to actually be less bureaucratic and look at the efficiency and effectiveness of what they're doing. And I think that some of that is unfounded, but in some respects, some of it is really needed, because it would push people and different agencies further into spaces where perhaps they can become more effective. And I do think what's needed in that space is also to become more open to political ideas and the ways that different organisations can move into spaces so that they're no longer apolitical, but they actually have a stance. The reason I think this is important is, and I have sort of touched on this already, is this whole idea around sustainability. Because I do feel that, and I know even my friends and colleagues that have worked in both humanitarian aid and disaster response, the sustainability of these teams, the highly, highly educated and trained teams, is not the way that we would expect them to be. And it's in part because they're completely exhausted by what they're doing.
So I hear you to be saying that neutrality is kind of contributing, the notion of neutrality, the attempt to kind of metabolize that in these unworkable situations, is actually contributing to burnout at a human level. I'm curious to hear from you, Ilan and Kees. Do you have any responses to sort of the utility of neutrality? Is it something that can be recuperated in some form as a structuring principle for the global order in which these organizations work? Or do you agree with Emily that actually a wholesale reconsideration from first principles would be better?
Kees, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm only being humble listening to your stories, Emily. Being in the field under dire circumstances, right? Doing your job. So I really admire that. So that in the first place, right? So because that's also a reflection on my clean hands as an academic researcher, which are not clean because hey, that's also not neutral. And at the same time, listening to your story reminds me also of work done by a colleague of mine, Yuri Kaufman at the Netherlands Defense Academy. Um, he did some field work with Frontech. So yeah, yeah, so the European attempt to prevent refugees from entering the European Union, a discussion in its own right. But he figured out that under Frontech responders or military forces, there was also a role switching. So being confronted with a humanitarian situation, they started to be humanitarian actors more than anything else. So that is something that, in relation to what you can call street level bureaucrats, right? So making decisions on the fly is also part of I think your story. When it comes to the role of the institutions, what I recognize here in the Netherlands, being in the steering committee of a platform on humanitarian actions with members from different NGOs, is that there is really a debate in the NGO family, so to say, what role they should play or not to play when it comes to for example, violation of human rights. And knowing the humanitarian family, they are quite diverse of nature. So I see NGOs really taking an active political stand versus others being more cautious to be outspoken. So in that humanitarian family, you will see quite some diversity when it comes to the right, the political dimension of their actions.
It's also very interesting to suggest actually maybe it doesn't need to be a monolithic reform, that actually maybe there could be a heterodox approach where different humanitarian organizations exist on a spectrum of political embeddedness, and maybe there's a space for supposedly neutral actors,
exactly,
engaged actors.
So sort of, sorry for that, but sort of in analytical terms, neutrality becomes then sort of a boundary concept. You know, it's something to talk about. So what does it mean in reality? Knowing that, hey, being neutral is it a myth? But it's not possible. You become involved in the social political context of where you operate. But what I noticed among the practitioners working in the NGO sector is that it became something to talk about and to attach meaning to more than anything else.
Ilan, where do you stand on this question of sort of the capacity for recuperation of neutrality or wholesale overthrow, or perhaps what Keith seems to be suggesting is the kind of performativity of neutrality, even if everybody knows that it's a fiction?
Yeah, I very much agree with Emily and Case. Question everything all the time. And I guess you could question that also. The key is that neutrality rose within disaster response because people questioned. Henri Dunant saw what happened on that battlefield, questioned, and changed. And there's a long history of humanitarian aid before 1859 where people questioned and changed. Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian Arctic explorer, came along in the early decades of the 20th century, questioned what was going on regarding disaster aid and humanitarianism, and tried to effect very substantive, very significant change. Then Emily mentioned what happened during the Biafran War, 1967 to 1970, when a lot of doctors were not happy with what they were doing with the Red Cross. They actually felt that témoignage, the act of witnessing and bearing witness and reporting bearing witness, was important. They questioned, they changed. And then from Médecins Sans Frontières came Médecins du Monde, MDM, and it continued. We had the end of the Cold War, and people thought, finally, we have peace. This is it. No more conflict. We're all done. And then there were two major genocides, Rwanda and in the Balkans, as well as many more. A lot of humanitarians came out of that questioning. And there were some very powerful, very poignant books post 1990s, which sat down from experienced practitioners and said, what are we doing? Can we, should we even attempt to be neutral, impartial, independent, nonpartisan, non-aligned? And now today, of course, we have Emily, thank you, and many others who are continuing to question. None of this should ever undermine the courageous, successful, impressive, and absolutely to be venerated work which humanitarians are doing, risking everything, risking their lives. And pretending to be neutral has achieved so much. Rescued hostages, brought out prisoners who shouldn't be there, got aid into places that no one else could get into, led to vaccination campaigns, including the elimination of smallpox and rinderpest. And we're doing reasonably well on many other diseases like guinea worm disease and polio. There are certain limits, but all credit to the people who have done that, many who died because of it. Question, yes. Do not undermine what succeeds. Just try to be more and more successful, particularly the safety for the people who are enacting this in the conflict zones, in the danger zones, at risk of their lives.
Thank you, Ilan. And thank you all for these very thoughtful comments. Emily, I wanted to come back to you and your experience. And I guess I wanted to push us a little further on, we've been talking about how neutrality, I suppose, contributes to the difficulty of being in these situations. It contributes to that sense of moral injury, perhaps, around sort of being unable to live up to sort of some kind of unattainable standard. I wonder from your point of view, what sort of other if you could go back to those experiences, what else might you have put in the toolkit that may have made that career more sustainable for you and your colleagues? What alternatives might there be that you wish were the structuring concepts for that work instead of neutrality? And how would that have helped the experience to be both more bearable for you and potentially more effective for the people that you assisted?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think like a very difficult one because it's quite individualized. I think it really depends on the person and the experiences that they have and their positionality in where that they're going and the places that they're doing that work. I know for me, one of the big things was it's very difficult to try and get people to understand the experiences that you have had. And I do write about this in one of my articles where often people would ask me at dinner parties, what's the worst thing that you've ever seen or the worst thing that you've ever experienced? And I write about this whole idea that if you're comfortable asking somebody that at a dinner party, you almost have never seen death, the way it can quickly come, and the way it can envelop somebody and what that means for the person that's witnessing that. And often in my work, I have been in positions that are traumatizing and that are really awful. But you are re-traumatized by being asked these specific questions in that certain way. And so I think that's why within my PhD, I really fell into this whole idea of storytelling because as Kez has spoken about, is this participatory research approach. And I look at really arts-based research approaches where people tell these stories and they often visually tell these stories. And it's in a way that leaving space for people to feel comfortable to tell their own story. And I think for me, if I was to create a toolkit, it would be a lot around opening up spaces and making situations comfortable that I could tell these stories in a way that really gets it out of my system. But at the same time, I'm able to tell the story in a way that I tell the story I want to, which is very different, I think, to some other like if you go to counseling or if you go to get psychological support, which you often do post a mission with large humanitarian organizations, But I didn't always find that so helpful. And I think there is quite a lot of research on that now that says talking amongst your colleagues when you're in these high-risk professions actually has a lot more benefit to mental health than it does to seek somebody outside. And I'm not saying that seeking outside counselling is a bad idea, because I think it's a fantastic idea and that we should all really be doing that. But I do think that if we were to try and create a toolkit to help people re-establish themselves back into their own normal home lives, that maybe there needs to be that space to allow them to think through what they've just experienced.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I think it is, even though, of course, these are highly individualized experiences, I think it's incredibly valuable to have had that experience and to be able to think about how that might generalize for other people. In terms of what else might be in this toolkit, alongside this very fruitful notion that you've written about of this sort of open-ended storytelling, I'm actually thinking, Case, you mentioned earlier this notion of perhaps reciprocity or trust building as an alternative framework that one could use to structure disaster response. Number one, I guess, could you talk us through what might that look like? Could you almost give us a hypothetical scenario of disaster response under a neutral paradigm versus disaster response under a reciprocity paradigm? And then secondly, I guess I'm interested to probe, when many of the humanitarian organizations exist in conditions of such radical economic disparity to the populations and the vulnerable people they're serving, how can you have true reciprocity in situations of such sort of disparity? So could you just talk to us a bit more about these alternative conceptions that you posited to replace neutrality?
Good question. First, the participatory approaches among first responders that I was engaged in, and also participatory approaches with local communities. So about the first one, we just got an example firsthand when you, Emily, came with the example that, hey, during dinner parties, I'm asked, what is your worst experience? This question alone, right, is not a neutral question like, I want to have the data for my next article and I want to validate that first responders have the coping strategies. And so, no, instead of it is stepping back and listen to the stories. So it's, and even so, and that I learned that from a colleague of mine, Hala Kourashi, who's doing research on refugees, being a refugee herself, doing conversations and also listening to the narratives, sometimes not even stories, because they don't necessarily have a concrete plot or end, right? So the narratives, and then recognizing that a silence can be a meaningful moment during the conversation that you have. So she wrote an article about moments of silence during interviews with refugees. So and that comes with recognizing that, wait a second, it's not just I'm collecting data, but I'm trying to be engaged with the person in front of me or next to me. And there is a togetherness in then creating the knowledge about the lived experience of being a first responder in a disaster situation. So that's one. The other one, working with local communities. That's what I do here in Amsterdam. I did it also in an affiliation that I have with the university in South Africa, in University of Free State Bloemfontein, where we do participatory risk assessment in informal settlements, trying to understand, let's say, a bit analytical, but the social fabric of a community who lives in a disaster-prone area. Versus, okay, there is a disaster, you are coming in, you are trying to be engaged with the local population in the moment itself. No, it is a deep investment in a relationship with members of the local community. Here in Amsterdam, I do that with various meetings that I, together with community members, have set up. Not just to explore what are solutions in case, well, that's now the paradigm in Europe, in case that there will be a 3 days power outage. What will happen to the community? Who are the most vulnerable? There are vulnerable assessment forms that they can fill in versus, can we build on your understanding of the local situation here in the western part of Amsterdam, where there is a lot of poverty, poor social housing, and so forth? What are the underlying, let's say, mechanisms that will cause vulnerability in situations of a power outage? So, and that is really trying to create a co-ownership, not just about the solutions to a power outage. Let's say, okay, we need a hub where people can go to for information, and there will be also supply and what have you, versus trying to understand what are the underlying mechanisms of vulnerability in working together with community members. So a form of engagement, if you will.
Thank you, Kees. I think what's very interesting about what's been said so far is I think each one of you in your work is kind of pushing against this notion of a dominant institutional script for disaster response, which is kind of this technical, apolitical, command-driven activity. And arguably, neutrality is part of that. I'm conscious that, Ilan, in your work, you have kind of written about how this notion of disaster actually serves as a cover for the structural factors that can turn hazards and risks into disasters. And that I'm curious to understand, do you think this idea of neutrality is kind of aiding and abetting avoiding looking at those underlying political questions prior to a disaster happening, the human decisions that take place behind the scenes that allow populations to become vulnerable? Is neutrality kind of complicit in that in some way, or is it simultaneously complicit and part of the solution to fixing it?
So much is about how we apply it. Neutrality in itself, as we've discussed, has done so much. It has limits, as everything does. If we let it be complicit in creating, manufacturing, and perpetuating vulnerability, then it's up to us. It's not neutrality per se.
Mm-hmm.
If we say, actually, let's make neutrality be that we are not going to align ourselves with the government or with a subgroup. Instead, we want to treat everyone equivalently because we are neutral. Therefore, we must resolve vulnerability. We've used it as a way forward to try and stop disasters. So much is about up to us and our interpretation and how we apply it, rather than trying to blame a word, a concept, an abstraction for what people want to do anyway.
Very interesting. Emily or Kees, do either of you have any reactions to that?
I'll leave it to you, Kees.
Well, I can only agree. Otherwise, you are running into semantic discussions. And the same is true for the concept of resilience that has been maybe hijacked by neoliberal political agendas of, hey, you are now on your own because, hey, you want to be resilient. So we draw back as formal authorities and response organizations. And here you go, you are resilient. So yes, I agree. So I like the idea of ethics in action, or how did you frame that, Ilan? So
operational ethics.
Operational ethics. It's really about that, right? So yeah.
And I give scenarios. So one example, let's say, and they're all based on reality, but obviously condensed and summarized. There's an earthquake in a conflict zone. You go in as a medic to pull people out the rubble and treat them. And combatants say, thank you for being here. We'd love to have you help the civilians, but first you have to treat our wounded combatants. What do you do when you know that if you make those combatants healthy, they're going to go out and fight and perhaps kill the civilians that you then pull out of the rubble and treat? What do you do?
How would you propose we go about answering that question within the frame of operational ethics, Ilan?
Prevention is better than cure. Stop the war.
Mm-hmm.
And ensure that if you're in a seismic zone, your buildings do not collapse in an earthquake.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yes. Yeah.
I'm reminded in your invitation for this debate to not happen at the level of semantics that, just to reflect back at you, what I hear you to be saying is that, in a sense, the language is secondary to kind of the politics of what we choose to do with it, essentially. And that's the really, there are underlying interests to be served, and that's the thing we should be looking at. And regardless of what principle we would put at the center of any humanitarian response, it's possible that it too could be manipulated to some end. I'm reminded in a very, it's a strange context to be quoting it, but there's a wonderful quote from George Eliot in Middlemarch, where she talks about how there is no general doctrine which is not capable of eating out our morality if unchecked by the deep-seated habit of direct fellow feeling with individual fellow men, which I think is apt for this conversation. I want to bring us back, however, away from Middlemarch to disaster response. I wonder, it seems that if I wanted to sort of probe each of you to tell me a bit more about what you conceptualize disaster response as being actually for. Is it about saving lives, which is something that's been mentioned? Is it about restoring social order, buying time until structural change and hopefully prevention can be possible? Is it about community repair? It just seems to me that each of you implicitly seems to answer this question a bit differently. Could I ask each of you to be a bit more explicit?
Can I start off with that one? Because actually it was a question that I was thinking about this morning. I realized when I was reading through both Kez and Ilan's work, we shared some work to just prepare for this talk, and I really had quite a rigid idea about what disaster response was, and it was really taking it from my own personal background. And I was reading Kez's work about community networks, particularly networks that have kind of sprung up when there has been a situation like the European refugee crisis. And I thought, that's a really interesting way to look at disaster response, and it's incredibly accurate. I think that perhaps the rigidity, that the way that I have looked at it has been needed for the work that I've done so far. But I did wonder when I was reading that if I've missed elements as a result in my own work, that it'd be quite interesting to go back and do my PhD again. I like genuinely loved doing my PhD. I'm one of the few people that can say that. So
Emily, you can do another PhD.
I could be poor forever. But I was thinking about that, like who would be the other disaster responders within that group? And I do write a little bit about the religious groups that I went and spoke with, and the NGOs, and there's a group of women called the Ladies, which is quite a gendered term, but there was actually a really beautiful respect that the other disaster responders had for these women that were feeding them every day. And I thought that these are all like part of this wider network of disaster response, and what does that really look like? And then even further into that, when I was reading Ilan's work, and I was very curious because there was one part where he was talking about the responsibility of the researcher when they're doing this disaster research, because you're really changing the trajectory of a place when you bring in disaster research into that area. You're making it seemingly more vulnerable to disasters because now suddenly somebody's written about it, and what does that do from an insurance perspective, and how does that change the way that people see that area? So I think that not only is a disaster responder and the ethics associated with that very varied, but also as an academic coming into that place, are you then sort of by proxy now a disaster responder? So that's my thoughts.
Very interesting. Ilan and Case, did you want to respond to anything Emily said or answer my question about the purposes of disaster response?
To me, the purpose of disaster response should be to ensure there is never another disaster. In practice, it's very compartmentalized to saving lives and creating temporary structures. That in itself does plenty. All credit to the people who do manage to achieve that and ensure that at least in the short term, people are living and they are comfortable. Nonetheless, this is a perpetual debate. How do we ensure we are thinking in the long term from hour one? How do we connect that so-called response phase to the longer term activities? And I absolutely very much support what Emily said, that disaster researchers too often are actually disaster responders, but do not see themselves that way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree as well. So let's say the disaster risk reduction, prevention. There is one reason why I make the connection in my chair, but I'm not the only one by far, between disaster governance and societal resilience. Resilience not being bouncing back, but really different forms of organizing, transitions in organizations or societies or communities, for that matter, to prevent a disaster from happening again under similar circumstances. When it comes to what is then disaster research and disaster response, it's also to Elon's answer, Sally. It is also depending or contingent on the phase of the disaster response. They are analytical phases and contested, but there is the response, mitigation, recovery, prevention, preparation, and prevention, and all that. They matter for me as a researcher, because you see different actor groups being active in the different phases of the disaster. But moving away from just the response, rescuing people, and then wait for the next disaster to happen, versus invest in reducing vulnerability of communities that are potentially affected by the disasters. That for me is very important in the disaster research.
I think it's an interesting question too, back to your suggestion perhaps about letting 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of different organizations adopting different stances on this question of neutrality. I wonder if there's also a position that says, that neutrality can be a more or less useful concept at different phases of disaster response, that there might be a set of actors at a certain phase of the disaster where that concept can be mobilized in a useful way. And then for a phase, for example, in the prevention phase, to get at the structural issues that caused the disaster in the first place, one would think that neutrality is possibly less useful in that context. So there's some temporal nuance there, I suppose, in terms of how the term is mobilized. Emily, I wanted to come back to you and this story you tell about your pilot, which I think is quite affecting. And you've said elsewhere that disaster responders are no longer apolitical. And I think you were telling the story of this pilot as sort of saying that disaster responders today are different to those in the past. I'm curious to probe, is it true, were disaster responders ever apolitical, or is this more of a recent realization rather than a recent change? And if so, what are the factors that have catalyzed that realization among frontline responders?
I personally think that they probably were always political, but there are different reasons as to why they needed to stay more silent. And I don't think they've actually always stayed silent, because otherwise we wouldn't have this long history of breakaways from the Red Cross movement into different other arms of humanitarian work. I do think from this pilot in particular, a lot of it was related to social media. So for him, he felt that he had a totally different level of education as a result of how much influx he'd had on social media related to politics and policies around the world that he disagreed with. And he felt that he had more education around the nuances, which I thought was really interesting, because he said that typically, he was part of the military, and I was talking to him alongside 3 other pilots, and they were all talking about their social media as their main platform for understanding the world. I think that social media does have a very strong aspect in politicizing people, and but maybe more vocally than what you would see if you were just having a conversation with them. And I wondered if perhaps that had an element to do with it, but I'm not sure if the others wanted to add into that.
Case?
Yeah. So yeah, social media for sure. That is then that has been sort of popular about 15 years ago in participatory approaches, recognizing the strength of what they call digital humanitarians. So local testimony posted on social media, that being open access in the hands of response organizations, humanitarian organizations, are helpful sources to understand places that are hit by disaster more than others, understanding forms of vulnerability. That now hasn't been a debate about biases in information on social media, misinformation, and that social media in itself became highly political. So that's one. Another sort of trend that I also see is a nexus with other, let's say, domains like the consequences of climate change, where you see that humanitarian actors and agencies become also engaged in climate activism. Recognizing the serious consequences of climate change for local communities that are now more at risk, you feel sort of an obligation to tell. So you become engaged in a political debate because, hey, climate adaptation in itself is political, about the displacement of people, for example. So social media, yes, I definitely recognize it. And then also the nexus with other fields, domains, but also in practice.
Thank you all. In these closing minutes, the seminar really has raced by. I wanted to close by asking each of you to talk about where you see the conversation about disaster response moving productively in a way that gives you energy. Are there any organizations or initiatives where you see genuine shift around moving beyond neutrality or reconceptualizing it so as to do disaster response differently? Are there any examples or case studies that you could share that should give us all some hope?
I wouldn't. Oh, go ahead, Emily.
No, you go. You go.
No, please.
For me, I like something around the sustainability of these disaster response teams is something I find incredibly interesting, because I think, firstly, that you don't find too much research on their individual ideas and thoughts and how they remain sustainable disaster responders. There's a lot more research really on the impacted communities, and so there is a few researchers that I think are doing things quite differently. Like, I really like Tine Mollendijk's work, because I think she really looks through this lens of like what is the moral injury of soldiers and also disaster responders, and then how do they think through how they can kind of continue. So I think there is space now where researchers are able to sort of move into this area to try and help facilitate this sustainability. And within that, because we don't have to be neutral as well, maybe that's a way of shifting this pressure of neutrality of certain different organizations where they have to remain neutral. So I really see this as the applied role of researchers, and I think it's quite an exciting space.
Thank you. Ilan, did you have anything to say there? I wonder too about your concept of operational ethics coming into play here.
I want to see more Emilys. I want to see more people with the operational experience coming into academia and teaching us.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see the reverse. I want people who have been academics to have more appropriate operational experience. I have nowhere near what Emily has done or the qualifications. I'm just the first aider and mental health first aider. Also trained in using fire extinguishers. So the very basics, just what we need day to day. It does help me think about the philosophies being exciting, the concepts being exciting, the vocabulary, semantics, discussions being exciting. What does it really mean? Not just in terms of how can we define neutral so that it makes more sense, but different cultural ideas and applications of neutrality and the synonyms, different ways in which peoples and different sectors and different professions have used or disdained neutrality. To me, it is not about going beyond neutrality. It is not about reconceptualizing neutrality. It is saying, should we go beyond neutrality? If so, how? If not, why not? If we're going to reconceptualize it, what are the options? What words should we use? From what languages? From what cultures? Or maybe what we have is actually the best we can achieve while still questioning it and accepting this duality operationally.
Mm-hmm.
No one can ever be neutral pretending to be so and trying our best achieve so much to be celebrated.
I'm actually going to presumptuously cut you off, Case, before we answer, just because we have at the last minute had another question come through, which I'd love to involve, since we haven't had huge numbers of questions. But Amy McLennan has asked whether the panel could speak a little bit about the relationship between funding and neutrality in the context of disaster response. How do the financial incentives line up here? Would anybody like to jump in to respond to that question?
I mean, go ahead, KSB, you're cut off.
Well, yeah, very delicate question. and a question also about accountability. There are many ways to approach this question. One is from a governance perspective, and I was talking about accountability of one of the issues in disaster governance. So is there, what kind of accountability can we see? We're talking about also analytically speaking. Horizontal accountability, versus the people living in communities affected by disaster situations, and vertical accountability. So you are actually accountable vis-a-vis your donors to explain what you did with the donor money in a disaster context. And that comes with an awful lot of reporting, assessments, and so it's very technocratic. That's one. Second is, how should I phrase it? Seeing donor countries, in particular the US, drawing back from humanitarian action, reducing funding for humanitarian actions an awful lot. Other donor nations, so to say, they step up, including, for example, the Gulf states. I was in discussions with members of humanitarian agencies, so NGOs basically, let me put it this way, under what conditions should we or not accept funding from those new states in relation to questions of humanitarian neutrality, human rights, and so forth. Quite open questions at first, but then instantly you're coming into the political debates. So again, two things. It's about upwards accountability, and it's about also the rise of new donor states.
Fascinating. Ilan or Emily, do you have anything else to comment there about the relationship between funding structures and the principle of neutrality?
It's up to the funders. Some of them say, we will fund you if you can show how you'll be neutral. Others are explicit. They do not want you to be neutral. And they say you must endorse these principles and these approaches, which are sometimes religious, sometimes cultural, sometimes political. It is really up to the funder.
Mm-hmm.
And I think adding on that, it's also, it does have global ramifications as well. So I know we're seeing this with the US. I've got some friends and colleagues who work on climate change or gender in the US, and they just are really struggling to get funding. And they're now using different words to explain their research. And it's kind of going back to the idea again of what is neutrality? Is it really a word, or are we just using it to sort of band-aid situations? And I think a lot of people are doing that in the US. They're now using it was really interesting, the wording changes to not say climate change in the US on my friend's website, because he was too worried about what funding was going to look like. So these do have huge ramifications, because now we're seeing a lot more US academics coming to Europe and Australia, and what does that mean with this changing sort of landscape? So it's very interesting.
That's thanks for that reflection. I'm with you, Elin. At the same time, if it is the donors to decide whether or not this is for political reasons as well, what you then also can see is some pragmatic or sometimes opportunistic behavior of those accepting the budgets, right? So it's also about the interaction, about the donor and the humanitarian community, maybe.
Fascinating. Well, I'm sorry, it somewhat took us off that hopeful arc that I was hoping to close out the conversation with, but I nonetheless felt it was very important that we address that. So we've actually slightly overshot the hour, so I'm going to take this opportunity to close. I think what I've come away with today is just a profound sense of the moral ambivalence of this idea of neutrality and the necessity of holding the paradox of it as being a standard which, as Emily has so powerfully shared, can impose additional psychological and emotional burdens on people whose careers effectively become unsustainable for them as a result of that and many other factors. But on the other hand, as Ilan has pointed out, that nonetheless there may be still value in the striving to attain the unattainable, and maybe there is not a necessity to kind of reconcile that tension. It's just a necessity to be aware of it and to think about its implications. And I think what all three of you shared fundamentally was a call for more crossover between operational experience and academic study in terms of a commitment to that process without a firm sense of what the destination needs to be, a commitment to asking the questions, and a necessity for more Emilys, as Ilan very generously put it. So thank you all for sharing the depth of expertise and experience that you have today. It's been a very powerful conversation for me. And thanks also to our audience and the Brocher Foundation for this opportunity. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.